Most people do not ruin their lives in dramatic ways. They do it quietly, through small permissions that seem harmless while they are happening. They keep saying yes when they mean no. They keep ignoring exhaustion and calling it responsibility. They let stress decide the emotional tone of the day, then act surprised when everything feels heavier than it should. They remain available to what drains them, then wonder why their mind never feels fully their own. This is how a life begins to thin out, not through one catastrophe, but through repeated self-neglect that slowly becomes normal. That is why real self-discipline is not just about effort. It is not just about waking up earlier, doing more, or pushing harder. Sometimes the undisciplined life looks productive from the outside. The deeper issue is whether your inner world belongs to you or to whatever demands, pressures, moods, and people happen to reach you first. A stronger life begins when that changes, when your peace is no longer treated as expendable, when your direction stops being borrowed from noise, when your standards stop collapsing every time the day becomes difficult. Self-discipline, in the Stoic sense, is not performance. It is structure. It is the ability to remain governed by principle even when life becomes inconvenient, emotional, or loud. It is learning how to carry yourself in a way that does not leak force everywhere. And that kind of strength rarely begins in dramatic moments. It begins in the daily ways you either respect your own life or quietly betray it. The first strategy is this. 1. Make yourself a priority without guilt. A lot of people still think putting themselves last is a sign of goodness. They think constant availability means maturity. They think neglecting their own rest, clarity, health, and mental stability proves they are generous, dependable, or strong. But that idea starts breaking apart the moment life becomes demanding. Because the person who never protects his own energy does not become noble, he becomes depleted. The person who constantly postpones his own needs does not become admirable. He becomes scattered, resentful, and internally disordered. And after a while, even his kindness begins to weaken, because it is no longer coming from strength. It is coming from exhaustion. This is where many people confuse sacrifice with self-erasure. There is a real difference between carrying responsibility and living as if your own mind can always be the part that gets neglected. There is a difference between generosity and teaching yourself day after day that your peace comes last. If you keep doing that, your life starts to reflect it. Your patience becomes thinner. Your attention becomes weaker. Your decisions become less clean. You become easier to provoke, easier to tire, easier to pull away from what matters. And because it happens gradually, you often do not realize how much of your force you have lost until you need it, and it is not there. The Stoics would see this clearly. They did not admire a person for being endlessly available to everything. They admired order. They admired the man who could govern himself, preserve his judgment, and remain aligned with what is right. That becomes impossible when your own maintenance is treated like an afterthought. If your body is exhausted, your thinking suffers. If your mind is cluttered, your standards drop. If your life has no protected space for recovery, reflection, or silence, then the outside world begins entering you too easily. Prioritizing yourself without guilt is not vanity, it is responsibility at the deepest level, because the self you neglect is the same self that must carry your work, your relationships, your obligations, your future, and your mind. If that center keeps weakening, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. And this does not always begin in grand gestures. Sometimes it begins in very ordinary decisions, not answering every message immediately, protecting your morning before the world enters it, sleeping when your body needs sleep instead of performing availability, taking your own goals seriously enough to stop treating them like optional work to do only after everyone else has taken their portion of you. These things look small. They are not small. They are proof of whether your life has an owner, and once that shift begins, something else becomes impossible not to notice. You begin to see how often self-neglect becomes visible before it becomes verbal. Not in dramatic collapse, in presentation, in posture, in the physical language of a person who has quietly stopped treating himself like someone worth taking seriously. That leads to the second strategy. 2. Carry yourself with self-respect. The way you present yourself changes how you feel before it changes how others see you. A lot of people hear that and immediately think of vanity. But vanity is not the point. The point is congruence. Does the way you move through the day reflect self-command, or does it quietly communicate drift? Does your posture suggest readiness or retreat? Does your grooming reflect care or indifference? Does your environment support clarity or constantly mirror neglect back to you? These things matter because the body and the mind are not separate in the way people pretend they are. Stand carelessly long enough and you start to feel diminished before anything even happens. Live in disorder long enough and your thoughts often begin to take on the same shape. Dress like nothing matters, and some part of you starts absorbing that message, not all at once but subtly, repeatedly. This is why self-respect often begins in visible details before it deepens into character. The outside does not replace the inside, but it reinforces it. That is important because many people are waiting to feel disciplined before they behave with order. Usually, it works the other way around. You do the orderly thing before the feeling arrives. You stand straighter before confidence feels natural. You clean your space before your thoughts feel clear. You carry yourself more deliberately before your emotional state fully catches up. Action often teaches the mind what identity has not yet stabilized on its own. This is not about expensive clothes, perfection, or social approval. None of that makes a person strong. In fact, obsession with image is just another form of dependence. What matters here is something quieter: cleanliness, intentionality, a face that is not always broadcasting fatigue and collapse. A room that does not sabotage the person trying to think inside it. A way of walking, sitting, dressing and moving that tells your own nervous system, this life is being handled with care, because the opposite also sends a message. When you keep presenting yourself like someone half absent from his own existence, your mind begins adapting to that lower standard. It starts accepting slippage. And once slippage becomes familiar on the outside, it becomes easier to tolerate it on the inside as well. That is why self-respect made visible matters. It does not prove character, but it often protects it. It gives form to what you are trying to become. And even then, one danger remains. A person can begin to prioritize himself. He can begin cleaning up the visible signs of drift. He can start carrying himself with more order. And still lose the day before noon, because he lets one mood become the emotional ruler of everything that follows. That is why the third strategy matters so much. 3. Choose your emotional tone early. A day often begins going wrong long before anything major happens. It begins in the attitude you allow to lead. One irritation is left unchecked. One disappointment is given too much meaning. One anxious thought is obeyed too quickly. And before anything truly serious has happened, the emotional climate has already shifted. The face hardens, the voice changes, reactions become sharper, judgment becomes narrower. The day begins taking its shape, not from principle, but from mood. This is one of the quietest forms of weakness. Not feeling deeply, that is not weakness. Weakness is when every feeling is allowed to become a command, when heaviness becomes your posture, when frustration becomes your tone, when stress becomes the lens through which you interpret everything. Most wasted days are not destroyed by events themselves. They are surrendered to emotional momentum that was never interrupted early enough. The Stoic mind starts by rejecting that surrender. It does not say you should feel nothing. It says you should not obey everything you feel. That is a crucial difference. A bad mood is not a law, anxiety is not authority, irritation is not wisdom. These states pass through the mind, but the undisciplined person hands them the keys too quickly. He wakes up slightly off, then starts thinking from that state. He gets frustrated once, then speaks from frustration for the next 3 hours. He meets pressure with emotional leakage instead of command. And by the end of the day, he feels as if life happened to him when in reality much of the damage came from what he kept allowing inside himself. This is why emotional tone has to be chosen early, not perfectly, not theatrically, but deliberately. A calmer face, a steadier tone, a refusal to let the first wave of feeling decide how the next 12 hours will be lived. Sometimes self-discipline begins there, in the choice not to escalate internally, in the decision that this irritation will not become my identity for the day, this pressure will not become panic, this disappointment will not become permission to move carelessly. That kind of inner choice changes more than mood. It changes conduct. Because once emotional tone is chosen with some care, everything becomes cleaner, speech becomes more measured, problems stay closer to their real size. Other people have less power to drag you into their state. You stop multiplying difficulty through reaction, and over time this becomes one of the clearest signs of self-command. Not that you never feel deeply, but that your feelings no longer have unrestricted control over your behavior. Most people never realize how much power they lose each morning by waking up and immediately submitting to emotional weather. The disciplined person does something rarer. He notices the weather, but he does not let it govern the architecture of the day. And once you learn to choose your emotional climate more carefully, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. If not every mood deserves full control over you, then not every person deserves full access to you either. A lot of people lose themselves here without realizing it. They do not get destroyed by obvious enemies. They get worn down by repeated overexposure, by the person who always needs something, by the conversation that leaves them heavy every time, by the message that expects immediate emotional availability, by the subtle pressure to remain open, polite, responsive, and reachable far beyond what inner balance can actually sustain. This is one of the quietest ways peace begins to erode, not through conflict, but through access. That is why the fourth strategy matters. 4. Stay kind, but protect your peace. Kindness without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. That is a sentence many people resist because they have been taught to associate goodness with openness. They think being kind means being easy to reach, easy to lean on, easy to interrupt, easy to enter. But that version of kindness quickly becomes expensive because the mind that is too open stops feeling fully inhabited by itself. It becomes crowded. Other people's needs, urgencies, moods, confusions, and tensions begin passing through it all day. And if there is no gate, all of that leaves residue. This is where many decent people become weak. Not because they are bad, not because they lack generosity, but because they never learned that warmth and restraint are allowed to coexist. They know how to be polite. They know how to respond. They know how to listen. But they do not know how to remain themselves while doing it, so they keep taking in too much. They keep absorbing what should have stayed outside. They keep letting other people's states set the emotional temperature of their own inner life, then wonder why they feel mentally crowded and strangely tired in ways they cannot explain. A stronger person learns a different balance. He understands that kindness does not require unlimited access. He can be respectful without becoming porous. He can wish people well without offering them unrestricted entry into his attention, time, or emotional space. He knows that not everyone deserves the same degree of openness. Some people can be met with sincerity. Others should be met with courtesy and distance. Both can be clean. Both can be mature, and neither requires guilt. This matters because access shapes inner climate. The people you repeatedly let into your mind affect your pace, your tone, your stability, even your standards. Spend enough time around people who live in chaos, entitlement, neediness, resentment, or constant urgency, and you will need real discipline not to absorb their rhythm. Stay too available to those who do not govern themselves well, and you will slowly begin structuring your life around emotional weather that was never yours to carry. That does not mean becoming cold, it means becoming clearer. Often the strongest form of protection is not dramatic confrontation. It is less explanation, less availability, a slower response time, a cleaner sense of what belongs to you and what does not. You do not owe everyone intimacy. You do not owe everyone immediacy. And you do not need a moral crisis every time you decide that your peace deserves structure. There is maturity in learning how to remain decent without becoming reachable from every direction. And once you begin practicing that, something else becomes easier to see. Much of what people call kindness is sometimes only discomfort with tension. They would rather let others in than deal with the discomfort of disappointing them. They would rather absorb the private cost than create open friction. But that habit always asks for payment later, because every time you avoid the short discomfort of protecting your inner life, you usually buy yourself a longer discomfort afterward. That leads directly to the fifth strategy, because if life is going to keep pressing, demanding, and making noise, then protection alone is not enough. You also need steadiness under pressure. 5. Stay calm when pressure builds. Stress is part of life. Panic is a style of response. That distinction matters because many people speak as if pressure itself is what breaks them. Usually, it is not pressure alone. It is pressure entering a mind that immediately scatters. A plan changes. A deadline moves closer. A conversation becomes tense. Several small problems arrive at once. And suddenly the nervous system takes over the room. The face hardens, the breathing shifts, the thoughts narrow, the voice speeds up. And what could have remained a difficult moment begins becoming a disordered one. Calm is not passivity. It is not denial. It is not pretending something does not matter. It is the refusal to let pressure scatter your mind before you decide what matters. That is why calm has weight. It preserves judgment. It keeps problems closer to their real size. It prevents one stressful moment from infecting the whole day with unnecessary emotional chaos. When you remain steady under stress, your thinking stays cleaner. Your decisions improve. Your presence changes. People feel that you are not being governed by the same atmosphere that is governing everyone else. That is one of the clearest signs of self-command. Most people underestimate how much damage panic adds to a situation. One problem becomes 3 because of reaction. One misunderstanding becomes a rupture because tone gets corrupted. One delay becomes a full mental collapse because the mind turns inconvenience into emotional emergency. The Stoic response is not to deny difficulty. It is to refuse it emotional authority before judgment has spoken. This is why steadiness matters so much. A calm person sees more. He can separate what is urgent from what is merely loud. He can distinguish what needs action from what only needs patience. He can keep proportion when others are multiplying the emotional volume of everything around him. That is real power, even if it does not look dramatic. In fact, its power comes partly from the fact that it is not dramatic. And calm often begins in simple places. A slower breath, a quieter face, a refusal to let agitation rush into speech, a narrowing of attention back to what is actually in front of you. What is happening right now? What is mine to do? What is noise and what is substance? These are not small questions. They protect the mind from becoming an accomplice to its own confusion. And people notice the difference. Most people are easily read when pressure builds. Their emotional state becomes public almost instantly. But the person who remains steady becomes harder to shake, harder to manipulate, harder to infect with unnecessary atmosphere. He becomes an anchor in the room without announcing himself as one. That kind of calm does not just improve outcomes, it changes identity. It makes life feel less like something that keeps happening to you, and more like something you are meeting with form. But calm alone is not enough if there is no direction. A person can be composed and still drift. He can be respectful, controlled and emotionally steady, yet still build his life around borrowed priorities, comparison and social noise. That is another kind of weakness. Less chaotic, but still costly. That is why the sixth strategy matters. 6. Set your own course. A weak life is easily pulled by noise, by what looks impressive, by what receives approval, by what other people want, by what appears urgent in the moment, by what seems to promise status, belonging, relief, or validation. This is how many people end up moving constantly, without ever building anything that truly belongs to them. Their days are full, but their direction is borrowed. Their effort is real, but their path is second-hand. And that is why discipline feels so unstable, because it is very hard to stay loyal to a life you never really chose. A stronger life is organized around values. That is where real direction begins. Not in mood, not in trends, not in applause, in values. Because values hold shape when emotion changes. They continue to matter when motivation drops. They outlast the emotional weather of a particular week. If a person knows what matters deeply to him, truth, strength, peace, loyalty, mastery, service, freedom, craftsmanship, growth, then choices become cleaner. Not easier, but cleaner. He stops needing to be reinvented by every passing feeling or comparison. He can measure opportunities, distractions, and decisions against something deeper than appetite. This is where self-discipline becomes more dignified than force. When direction comes from values, discipline stops feeling like constant self-violence. It begins feeling like alignment. You are no longer dragging yourself through life by temporary intensity. You are moving according to what you have already judged to be worth serving. That changes everything. It changes what you decline. It changes what you endure. It changes what you keep doing after novelty fades. It changes how much noise the outside world is allowed to make inside you. And that matters because comparison is one of the great thieves of direction. The moment you stop asking what looks good and start asking what is true to the life you are actually trying to build, distraction begins losing some of its power. Other people can still impress you, but they stop steering you. Trends can still exist, but they stop deciding your path. Setbacks still hurt, but they no longer turn into full identity crises because your direction remains intact even when progress feels imperfect. A person with direction suffers differently from a person without it. One experiences difficulty, the other experiences disorientation, and disorientation drains life fast. That is why setting your own course is not a motivational cliché. It is structural. It is the decision that your days will no longer be built around noise, borrowed standards, or external pressure alone. It is the moment your values become your compass and the shape of your life begins reflecting that change through repetition, through routine, through what you protect, through what you stop entertaining, through what you remain loyal to when comfort would be easier. And once direction becomes real, another question rises immediately. Because knowing your values is one thing, remaining loyal to them when pressure arrives, approval disappears, and standing by them becomes costly is something else entirely. A lot of people admire strength in theory. They like the idea of standards. They like the language of principle, integrity, and self-respect. But when those things begin asking for real cost, comfort suddenly becomes more persuasive. Agreement feels safer. Silence feels easier. Compromise begins disguising itself as maturity, and little by little, a person starts bending in places where he once thought he was solid. Not because he fully changed what he believed, but because he discovered that belief without loyalty has no real weight. That is why the seventh strategy matters. 7. Stand firm in what you believe. Direction is one thing. Loyalty to it is another. It is not enough to know your values in theory. They have to hold when there is pressure to soften them, hide them, postpone them, or betray them in exchange for approval, ease, or immediate relief. A person becomes harder to shake when his actions stop bending so easily around convenience. And that kind of stability cannot be faked. It is built in moments where no one is clapping, no one is agreeing, and the easier path is clearly available. This is where character stops being an idea and starts becoming structure. A lot of weakness in life does not come from ignorance. It comes from inconsistency. People know what matters to them, but they keep abandoning it at the exact moments when loyalty would cost comfort. They know they should speak honestly, but they adjust their words to stay liked. They know they should protect their time, but they surrender it under social pressure. They know which standards matter, but they lower them when being firm would make things awkward. Then they wonder why self-respect starts thinning out. But self-respect cannot survive repeated self-betrayal. Not for long. The Stoic mind takes a harder position. It says, your values are not ornaments. They are not there to decorate your identity when life is calm. They are there to govern you when life tests you. That is what reveals whether they are real. If your standards disappear the moment agreement disappears, they are not standards yet. They are preferences. If your principles hold only when they are comfortable, they are not principles. They are moods dressed as convictions. This is why loyalty matters more than intensity. Intensity can look strong for a moment. Loyalty builds something quieter and more durable. It allows a person to stay aligned, even when no emotional reward is available. And that changes the way he carries himself. He becomes less easily seduced by applause, less easily bent by fear of standing alone, less dependent on immediate comfort to keep acting according to what he already knows is right. That does not mean becoming rigid for the sake of ego. It means developing enough backbone that your life does not keep changing shape every time the social temperature shifts. It means being able to tolerate misunderstanding without panicking. It means enduring moments where you are not mirrored, praised, or made comfortable, and still remaining faithful to what matters. That is not stubbornness. That is inner weight. And once a person begins standing more firmly in what he believes, another danger becomes easier to see. Many people think seriousness alone will protect them. They become so focused on standards, discipline, pressure, and carrying life well that they begin losing flexibility. They start treating every inconvenience like a verdict, and every flaw like proof against themselves. They become respectable, but inwardly rigid. They become responsible, but mentally heavy. And if that continues long enough, discipline starts hardening into strain. That is why the 8th strategy matters. 8. Use lightness to stay resilient. Life gets heavier when you treat every inconvenience like a crisis and every flaw like a verdict. That does not mean pain is not real. It does not mean hardship should be laughed away. It means the mind often multiplies suffering by clutching too tightly, by making everything symbolic, by turning one mistake into an identity statement, by letting every frustration thicken into private drama. A disciplined person needs more than endurance. He needs perspective. He needs elasticity. He needs a way not to become mentally rigid under the weight of ordinary life. This is where humor, wit, and lightness become surprisingly serious tools. Not because they make life shallow, but because they protect proportion. They stop the mind from over-magnifying everything. They keep tension from becoming your permanent emotional style. They interrupt the self-importance that makes every inconvenience feel larger than it is. Sometimes one of the healthiest things a person can do is notice the absurdity of his own frustration and refuse to worship it. That is not weakness, it is recovery. To laugh at yourself occasionally is not to disrespect yourself. It is to loosen the grip of ego. It is to remind yourself that not every misstep deserves ceremony, not every imperfect moment deserves a verdict, and not every bad day means life is collapsing. Without that lightness, the mind starts becoming unnecessarily dense. Everything lands too hard. Every error lingers too long. Every challenge feels like evidence of some deeper deficiency. That is how a serious person slowly becomes a brittle one. And brittle people break in ways calm people do not. This is why lightness supports resilience. It gives the mind room to breathe. It allows you to carry pressure without letting pressure define your personality. It keeps you from becoming one of those people who move through life with constant inner tightness, unable to see perspective because they are too committed to their own emotional weight. A person who can retain some wit under pressure, some humor in imperfection, some looseness in the face of ordinary frustration is often stronger than the person who looks severe all the time. Because severity is not the same as strength. Sometimes it is just fear of softness. Sometimes it is ego trying to prove substance through tension. But real strength has more range than that. It knows how to carry seriousness without becoming grim. It knows how to suffer without turning suffering into identity. It knows how to remain self-commanded without becoming emotionally armored to the point of deadness. This matters in relationships too. A person with no lightness becomes exhausting to be around. He fills rooms with tension. He makes conversations narrow. He turns ordinary imperfections into moral events. But the person who can stay grounded while also allowing some warmth, some wit, some proportion into the atmosphere creates something very different. He brings relief without carelessness. He brings depth without heaviness. He becomes easier to trust because he does not collapse into drama every time life becomes inconvenient. That is a rare form of stability. And once a person becomes a little lighter inwardly, another line becomes easier to draw with clarity. Because the same maturity that allows lightness also reveals how often people confuse respect with self-loss. They call it politeness. They call it peace. They call it being good. But very often it is something weaker hiding under civilized language. That is why the 9th strategy matters. 9. Set clear boundaries and enforce them. Most people do not lose peace because they are evil or weak. They lose it because their limits are vague. That is how erosion works. Not through one dramatic collapse, but through tolerated overreach. A line is crossed once and left uncorrected. A request is accepted with hesitation, then repeated until it becomes expected. A pattern of disrespect is explained away because confronting it would create discomfort. One yes leads to another. And over time a person begins living in a reality shaped more by what others keep taking than by what he has clearly decided to protect. This is one of the most expensive forms of self-neglect, because it rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. It often looks like patience, flexibility, understanding, being easy to deal with. But underneath that appearance, something else is going on. Energy is being negotiated away. Time is being fragmented. Attention is being claimed by forces that were never supposed to have that much access. And eventually, peace begins to feel fragile, not because life became impossible, but because structure was never strong enough to hold against pressure. That is why boundaries matter. A boundary is not a mood. It is not a sentence spoken once in frustration and then abandoned the moment someone resists it. It is a form of order. It tells the world where your time ends, where your energy stops being public property, what your standards are, and what your life will no longer be built around. Without that order, peace becomes negotiable, and whatever is negotiable gets pressured. Many people fail themselves here while still sounding reasonable. They say they need space, but stay constantly reachable. They say they value their time, but hand it over whenever pressure rises. They say certain treatment is unacceptable, but continue explaining themselves to people who have already shown they do not care. In other words, they want the relief of boundaries without the friction of boundaries. But friction is part of it. Any real boundary reveals something. It reveals who respects form and who only respected access. It reveals who can adjust and who feels entitled. It reveals how much of your previous peace was being purchased by self-betrayal. That is why weak boundaries feel easier at first. They preserve short-term comfort. They delay awkwardness. They keep things socially smooth. But later they become costly, because the price gets paid in resentment, exhaustion, confusion, and the slow collapse of self-trust. And self-trust matters more than people think. Every time you feel the line, notice the strain, sense the no, and still proceed as though none of it matters, you teach yourself something dangerous. You teach yourself that your own signals are advisory, not binding. That your inner life can raise the alarm and still be overruled by guilt, pressure, or the desire to avoid discomfort. Over time, that weakens the whole structure of self-discipline, because discipline is not only the ability to command yourself, it is also the ability to believe your own commands mean something. This is why a boundary, properly enforced, protects more than time. It protects identity. It says, my life will not remain open from every direction. My energy is not here to absorb what others refuse to govern in themselves. My goodness will no longer be measured by how much I can tolerate while slowly disappearing inside it. And once that becomes real, not theoretical but enacted, something changes. There is less leakage, less private irritation, less apologizing for the simple fact of having limits, more order, more self-respect, more internal stability. And often the strongest boundary is not verbal, it is behavioral. A slower reply, a repeated no, a topic no longer entertained, a pattern no longer rewarded, a shorter visit, a cleaner distance. One of the marks of maturity is learning that not every limit needs an explanation, and not every explanation strengthens the limit. Some things become clearer when you stop discussing them and simply stop permitting them. And that leads to the final strategy. Because protecting your time is not enough if what drains you still lives in your routines, your environment, your mental habits, and your repeated exposures. You can defend your calendar and still poison your inner life. You can reduce contact with difficult people and still rehearse their voices in your head all day. You can say no outwardly while continuing to say yes inwardly to patterns that weaken you every week. That is why the 10th strategy matters. 10. Cut out negative energy ruthlessly. Some people drain you, some habits drain you, some environments drain you, some thought patterns do the same. And one of the reasons this remains hard for people is that what drains them is not always dramatic enough to feel like a threat. It often feels familiar, ordinary, routine. A person you always feel tired after seeing. A digital habit that leaves you foggy, envious, distracted, or mentally scattered. A room that keeps you dull. A private pattern of thinking that keeps turning ordinary difficulty into self-doubt. These things become dangerous, not because they're intense, but because they are repeated. Anything repeated long enough begins shaping identity. This is why progress often depends less on what you add, and more on what you stop allowing. People like addition because it feels hopeful, a new plan, a new habit, a new routine, a fresh beginning. But very often growth accelerates more through subtraction, not because subtraction is glamorous, but because it clears resistance. It removes the things constantly leaking force from the system. A person can read more, train harder, organize better, and still feel stuck because too many quiet corruptors still have daily access to his mind. Some of those corruptors are external. Certain relationships do not damage you through open cruelty. They damage you through chronic depletion. They keep you slightly tense, slightly guilty, slightly off balance, slightly less yourself every time. Some environments work the same way. They normalize disorder. They keep the nervous system dull or overstimulated. They make steadiness harder than it needs to be. Other corruptors are internal, a style of self-talk that keeps making you smaller. a habit of revisiting what should be released, a tendency to interpret every setback as evidence against yourself. These patterns may be private, but they shape posture, conduct, standards, and destiny just as much as anything outside you. The Stoic response is not dramatic disgust. It is disciplined refusal. Look clearly, identify what repeatedly leaves you weaker, foggier, more reactive, more distracted, less proud of how you live. Then stop cooperating with it. Not in one emotional burst, then again next week when the mood changes. Repeatedly, cleanly, without drama if drama is not needed. That may mean less contact, less scrolling, less indulgence, cleaner routines, better sleep, stronger mental language, more honesty about the patterns you keep calling harmless, even while they continue lowering your standard. Familiarity is not innocence. Many people keep what is harming them because known discomfort feels easier than uncertain change. But everything tolerated asks for payment, and the payment is usually your clarity, your energy, your standards, your emotional range, your ability to move through life as someone who belongs fully to himself. That is really what this whole episode has been about. Not 10 random strategies, not 10 tricks for productivity, something deeper. It has been about learning how to stop scattering your life, making yourself a priority so your energy and peace stop being treated like leftovers. Carrying yourself with self-respect so the outer form of your life stops reinforcing inner neglect. Choosing your emotional tone early so one bad feeling does not steal an entire day. Staying kind while protecting your peace so decency no longer becomes overexposure. Staying calm under pressure so difficulty does not instantly become disorder. Setting your own course so direction comes from values instead of noise. Standing firm in what you believe so your standards stop bending around comfort and approval. Using lightness to stay resilient so seriousness does not harden into strain. Setting boundaries and enforcing them so peace stops leaking through tolerated overreach. Cutting out negative energy so what weakens you no longer receives daily permission to stay. Each of these strategies does the same thing in a different form. They close the leaks. And that is how a stronger life is built. Not only through one dramatic decision, but through what you stop allowing, what you start protecting, and what you repeat until it becomes character. Once that begins happening, life feels less scattered, more deliberate, more stable. Discipline is no longer something you perform from time to time when motivation is high. It becomes part of how you live. That is when life starts to level up for real.